What we've seen quite notably over the last 3 years is that stablecoins have come to take up a significant proportion of all illicit activity. If you were to take everything that happens on every chain across every crime type and basically aggregate it all together into an annual proportion. And now we're more or less sitting at around 60% of everything in terms of illicit activities happening on stablecoin. And that's a pretty consistent amount over the last several years.
Hello and welcome to Public Key. I'm your returning host, Eitan Danon. Join us as we complete our two-part series covering the 2025 Chainalysis Crypto Crime Report. In this episode, you will hear from our very own cybercrimes research lead, Eric Jardine, who helps us unpack what's new, the same, and what surprised even him in this year's report. Eric provides a nuanced analysis of illicit activity involving crypto and how these activities have shifted over the past year. He explains the increased diversification and professionalization in the crypto crime space, painting a comprehensive picture of the challenges facing law enforcement and the compliance sector. We also cover the shift in crypto usage from Bitcoin to stablecoins and altcoins, and the impact of real-world events correlated with on-chain behavior, explaining how these crypto crimes are mirroring geopolitical tensions. Before we jump into the episode, we at Chainalysis will be hosting our flagship event, Links, on April 1st and 2nd in the heart of New York City. Hear directly from some of the best speakers in the industry, including Vanessa Zhang from OKX, CJ Rinaldi from Kraken, Steve Strickland from Copper, and many other industry thought leaders from companies like PayPal, BVNK, Franklin Templeton, and more. By the time you hear this episode, we'll probably be setting up for our two-day event, so run to the show notes and grab your tickets now. Now, on to our episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Public Key. I'm your host, Eitan Danon. I'm joined today by cybercrimes research lead Eric Jardine. Welcome to the pod, Eric.
Thanks for having me on.
Always fun to have an internal episode and talk to the big brains at the company.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. We today are going to be discussing the crypto crime report that just came out a few weeks ago, focusing heavily on the macro elements of the report. Certainly, you drive a lot of the company's research, which informs so much of what we do here at Chainalysis. So it'll be great to get your takes on the report and what it really talks about and what you think are some of the top takeaways. So jumping right in, can you walk our listeners through how the overall illicit volumes change this year in comparison to previous years and what you think is driving that change?
Sure. I like to think about overall numbers in terms of both volumes and then also in terms of composition. So if we look at bar chart, for example, we have one of these in the report of total illicit volumes. You kind of have this up and to the right trajectory to illicit activity on chain over the last several years. There's a bit of a nuance, which hopefully we can get into maybe in a second here about the year over year change from last year to this year. But typically speaking, what we're looking at is volumes in 2024 that exceeded 40 billion. We suspect that's going to end up probably north of 50 billion when all is said and done, once attributions expand and kind of get backdated into the past calendar year. And that's going to be effectively, if that's right, about a record year. And it continues this kind of up and to the right trajectory. And then if you think about it from a compositional standpoint, you could imagine like taking each of those bars and then filling it by what kind of illicit activity we're observing. And when you do something like that, you can see some pretty sizable shifts over time in terms of the composition of illicit activity as a proportion of all illicit activity. And if you go far enough back, you're basically dealing with like the 2011 form of illicit activity, and it's all Darknet Markets. And then over time, what's happened is that's morphed and changed, as you'd expect from any kind of dynamic ecosystem. And so you move like through, so let's say 2020, and it's highly weighted towards scams. And you continue to move into the more recent years, and you start to see a compositional change. Scams remain prominent, but they're a smaller proportion than they used to be. And other forms of illicit activity, like sanctioned entity activity, for example, or sanctioned jurisdiction or stolen fund activity, those take up a larger share than they used to. So we're seeing both an increase in total dollar volumes and then also a change in composition over time.
Awesome. Well, certainly increase in total dollar volume, but our statistic holds that illicit activity on chain as a percentage of the market remains extremely small. Could you unpack that relationship a little bit for our listeners?
Yeah, for sure. It's almost a tale of two cities where on the one hand, volumes in dollar terms are up and to the right. And if you look at the trend on our illicit share measure, which essentially takes total volumes and divides it by total attributed activity, you actually get almost the opposite trajectory. So it's almost a down and to the right trajectory over time. So you're sort of seeing growth in total volumes coupled with expanded adoption generally. And the way the math would work out is that if you have increasing volumes, but your share measures declining, it has to mean that adoption is happening faster than the growth in illicit activity. So even though we're cresting 50 billion in total illicit activity in 2024, more likely than not. What that means is that adoption in 2024, for example, must have been significant. And I think if you look at some of the big macro factors in the legitimate crypto ecosystem, ETF approvals, just to name one sizable one from the year, it makes sense that what we're seeing is a rapidly expanding crypto ecosystem full stop. And then part and parcel of that is a growth in some forms of illicit activity over time as well. But it's a slower rate of growth than what we see with the overall crypto economy.
Thanks for breaking that down. For a while now at Chainalysis, we've been talking about the diversification broadly away from just Bitcoin. It used to be said that Bitcoin was king. That's no longer the case. In spite of recent all-time highs and kind of everything going on in the policy environment, we're seeing this diversification into stablecoins, into altcoins. Can you talk a little bit about some of the current dynamics in terms of the market share for each crypto? And to what extent do you think some of those dynamics are category specific? I know we talk about that in the report, but it would be helpful to have you kind of break it down a little bit for the listeners.
For sure. So yeah, again, if you went back to 2011 to 2013 and illicit activity on chain, it would be 100% Bitcoin. And it started to sort of shift in through, let's say, 2017 in particular, as you started to see alternative L1s get launched and tokens launched on there. And that's kind of been the broad arc of things for quite a while. What we've seen quite notably over the last 3 years is that stablecoins have come to take up a significant proportion of all illicit activity. If you were to take everything that happens on every chain across every crime type and basically aggregate it all together into an annual proportion. And now we're more or less sitting at around 60% of everything in terms of illicit activities happening on stablecoin. And that's a pretty consistent amount over the last several years. Again, linking this to what's happening in the crypto ecosystem overall, there's a reason for that I think is largely to do with the growth and prevalence of stablecoins generally, that's kind of like an emerging technology that's seen significant adoption over the last several years. And it's kind of mirrored in its occasional use in illicit activity. And given how terrible these stablecoins, if they have, for example, a centralized issue, can be for illicit actors, they can be frozen, they can be burned, etc. In some ways, it's a surprising trend to see it be that significant of a proportion, given what can happen. But that gets, I think, to the question about category-specific trends that you were mentioning, because given how bad of a tool these are for bad actors, you don't see them in some forms of, for example, predatory cybercrime. So ransomware actors would be one interesting example. They're locking out systems of critical infrastructure or companies or individuals or government institution or whatever it happens to be, and asking for or demanding a ransom, but they ask for or demand it in Bitcoin. They don't ask for it in stablecoins, for instance, because it would be an incredibly bad business strategy from the standpoint of the ransomware actor. Because the first thing that would probably happen is they would get the stablecoin issue would get notified, the funds would get frozen or burned, and then basically there's no value to extract on the part of the bad actor. And so there are these sort of silos, ransomware being one where Bitcoin remains predominant. You see another in, for example, Darknet Markets, where Bitcoin has historically been by far and away the dominant form of crypto used on those marketplaces. We're seeing increasingly a pivot there where a lot of markets, like when we profile in the abacus market, is sort of using both Bitcoin and privacy coins like Monero. So there's kind of this dual ecosystem emerging in some darker marketplaces. And then you see other forms of illicit activity that kind of operate predominantly on others, but they're a bit more eclectic, like scams is not heavily weighted in any meaningful capacity whatsoever towards
more of a hodgepodge.
It's a big hodgepodge because basically the scammers are trying to reduce points of friction with potential victims. And the last thing a scammer would want to do is say, hey, pay me in Monero or some other hard to access cryptocurrency. Even if it's private, even if it's anonymity and privacy enhancing for the scammer, it's just going to like crater your success rate. And so they'll tend to focus where it seems plausible from the standpoint of the victim that this is a legitimate sort of investment or whatever the scam happens to be. So they'll be asking for stable coins or hot new tokens or Bitcoin or something that's knowable, easy to access, these sorts of things. So it's a big hodgepodge of like whatever current or topical. And so you do see this mix. So, the aggregate total, that 60-ish% that's weighted towards stablecoins is just not something that scales to the subcategories. You really have to scratch the surface on each individual one in order to say like this category, ransomware, is only or almost only Bitcoin, for example.
What trends would you say stand out the most in this year's report? I mean, you have not only in the conceptualization, but also in talking through a lot of our researchers and subject matter experts through a lot of the ground truth findings, and your hands are dirty, I think, in a lot of the data. What would you say as you were doing the research this year? What stood out to you? And do you think there was more continuity or more of a break from what we saw in 2024?
I think, like with any sort of thing on a year over year basis, there's a bit of both continuity and change. I think the continuous part would be the volumes. They're kind of in line with what we saw in the past couple of years. And so we wouldn't see, for example, a significant upward or downward revision, as you can imagine happening. I mean, downward suggesting global coordination on enforcement efforts or something that would be net positive, and then obviously an upward revision, which would be something like some new bad actor entered the scene and it was historically unprecedented, something like that. So volumes are more or less in line with what I'd kind of expect, given kind of an impressionistic view of adoption and what's happening in the ecosystem. Where I think there is some discontinuity, though, is we saw a pretty big growth in illicit actors that are facilitating professionalization of this ecosystem. And those actors, I think, are facilitating the other forms of illicit activity that we have tracked for many years now. So, for example, we spend a lot of time in the report talking about ways in which there are scam adjacent illicit actors that are basically providing technologies or toolkits for scammers that have this tendency to amplify what they're able to do in terms of the
Like the
scale of their scamming activity, for example.
connective tissue of scam facilitation, something akin to that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's kind of a good segue. I mean, I know last year we put out our money laundering report on professional money laundering. And I think one of the bottom line conclusions of this year's report was that crypto crime is diversifying way beyond just the regular cybercrime categories. I mean, certainly stolen funds, ransomware, DNMs, right? Kind of that activity is still a mainstay. But I think for those who have not read it yet, when you look at the report, one of the things that came across to me was the expansion of on-chain facilitation, on-chain crime, and crime with a crypto nexus to crime types that previously did not really have broad crypto overlay, or perhaps did, but at a much smaller scale. So violent crimes, organized, transnational organized crime, illicit wildlife trafficking. We have a section this year on extremism beyond kind of the pale of your classic Islamist groups in the Middle East. So kind of more than your average categories, and it would be great, I think, for listeners to hear from you about this change. More diversification, more professionalization. What are some of the practical considerations for you as you do research and shape the agenda and do a lot of the digging to kind of come up with these conclusions? What are some of the considerations, or what are some of the things you see on chain and off chain relating to this trend?
One of the things that is true about analyzing blockchain data is you have really high fidelity record of the sequence of events and the origin point and the destination of the transfer of value. So you could say, like, at this point in time, this wallet sent to that wallet. When you overlay attributions onto that, so for example, if you know that a destination is a scam, you have some reason to suspect that with a high degree of confidence, then you could say, like, these inflows to that destination are probably, for example, scam volumes. And that's kind of the way in which we've, typically speaking, estimated these volumes associated with illicit activity. Now, where things start to get complicated with some of the categories that you were mentioning, where you're kind of moving into off-chain crime that's facilitated simply by a payment rail, or things
Right.
where there's a little bit more definitional uncertainty and stuff like that, is you start to maybe know like half of the picture, but you're not sure about who's sending to whom. So for example, in the professional sort of constellation of services surrounding scams, you have things like AI brokers that are basically providing face swapping tools or LLMs to engage in chats or whatever it happens to be. And what you might see is inflows from what, for all intents and purposes, it looks like a legitimate source into these illicit sort of services that are like publicly advertising that they're providing these tools. And then you could have to start to think, instead of thinking about it in terms of a flow from A to B, you have to start to think about it more in terms of something like statistical associations. So for instance, if scammers are leveraging these services, you might not see a scam wallet sending into an AI vendor wallet. What you might see is some personal wallet sending into an AI vendor wallet. And then you might see at some later point that the scam wallet in question starts to receive higher inflows. And you can quantify that process and the amount of elapsed time and things like that. But the on-chain representation, the statistical representation are kind of two separate ways to approach the problem. Likewise, if you're thinking about some of the other categories, it's a bit hard and at times to do at scale because you don't necessarily have good broad-based attributions of illicit wildlife traffickers, for example. So you have to sort of start from a single address and kind of build out a network view from there. Doable, but they're using it for sort of a different function, kind of like a parallel payment system as opposed to a typical scammer type approach or typical darknet market where it's a lot more like, here's the address, here's where you want to send some value, for example. So similar, but a bit different. So it requires expanded concepts and expanded methods in order to try to analyze these data. And the final thing I might say just on the point is that one of the things that we did across multiple sections in this year's report that I think speaks to this diversification and the broadening of the ecosystem is look at the intersection of real world events and on-chain activity. And so in the extremism section that you mentioned, one of the things we were able to look at was the change in the intensity of support for extremist groups in Europe and how it sort of coalesced around elections that happened within the region. So there were several, like 2024 globally was a big year for democratic elections, and there were several in Europe. And what we saw, typically speaking, was elections tended to have a bit of a catalytic effect on the intensity of support for extremist groups within the region. And in a totally different vein, but along the same kind of lines, in the section on sanctions, we explored how tensions between Iran and Israel coincided in time with big outflows of Bitcoin from the Iranian exchange ecosystem, sort of suggesting that people are using Bitcoin as a sort of store of value asset that's a safe haven from geopolitical tensions. And so we're sort of moving in that direction as well to kind of look at how these real world events intersect with on-chain movement of funds that we can see as a function of like the timing of events and what happens before and after.
That's fascinating. I mean, at the risk of outing both of us as super nerds, I think it's probably a little too late for that. But I think part of the magic of blockchain analytics in general and of Chainalysis data in particular is being able to take an inflection point or have a temporally bounded window and say, we know this was going on in the real world. Let's take a look on chain and see what we can see either at a macro level or very tactically. And I'm sure for you who you live and breathe our data, being able to pick something apart and say, well, look at this transaction pattern or look at these deposits. Something about them is a bit off or something about them is very consistent, and it suggests, even if you don't know what was going on in real life, it very often can give us a hunch, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's more in the world of organized crime, whether it's a regulatory question. I think that's an extremely powerful workflow and a way of seeing the world. So I'm glad you brought up those two examples on sanctions and extremism. Can you talk a little bit about our mid-year findings and in 2024 and how those relate to what we came up with in the crime report most recently, the 2025 crime report?
Absolutely. There were two here that took me aback a little bit. Stolen fund activity and ransomware would be the two I would point to. And the reason I would highlight the two of those is that, at least as it pertains to stolen fund activity, we were kind of on track for a 3 billion plus year. And so I'd actually did a little bit of poking around and produced a formal statistical estimation of where I thought the year would end. And it was somewhere between like 2.7 and 3.3, I think is what I came to. And we were nowhere near it. Basically, one of those instances where the outlier-driven nature of stolen fund activity really reared its head. So through the mid-year report, stolen fund activity was trending to be the second highest year ever per our data. However, around the end of June, early July, basically was flat. There were still events and value was still compromised, but the rate at which it accumulated basically just petered out. And so if you imagine like a cumulative curve that never goes down and is just a sum of the last several months added to the new month, it basically just flattened out. And that was peculiar and unexpected. What was telling, again, sort of thinking back to the conversation just now about the intersection of real world events with on-chain events, is that the timing was a little bit suspicious. So it happened right after Russia and DPRK had their summit. And so it seemed plausible through the course of the tail end of 2024 up into the publication of the report that there may have been some sort of conversation had there. Obviously no intelligence or information to say that there was definitively this going on, but basically it was suspicious that the DPRK seems to have slowed slowed their activity in the second half of the year following the summit to a notable degree. So we actually quantify the exact reduction in the report for that section this year. And it's a fairly significant drawdown. And we don't see something similar with the decline with other hacking and stolen fund activity. So for everybody else, it was more or less like the second half looked like the first half in terms of the average amount of activity. But for the DPRK, it was significantly less. Now, there's a couple of things there, in light of the Bybit hack and that sort of thing. Like obviously the DPRK.
I was going to say, fast forward to early 2025.
Right. And so obviously the DPRK did not disappear. And it is possible that they were spending time during the second half of the year preparing for something big in the first half of 2025 here. And so that's where like the qualification, like we don't have concrete evidence. This is more like the timing is suspicious and we can go not much further than that. But it's also possible if you look at again, to the sort of geopolitical question, the DPRK seems to have changed its approach to collaboration with Russia in early 2025 as well. So there's also like this shifting dynamic there that maybe any agreement that had been struck may have been changed or rescinded or whatever. Or it may be that the DPRK was basically preparing for a series of sizable events and they just didn't happen in the second half of 2024. I remain kind of agnostic about exactly what's happening here, but the timing that we saw through the publication of the section was very suspicious. And interestingly enough, unrelated completely, ransomware had the same pattern. So we were sort of saying like this is on track through the mid-year update to be at least as bad as our 1 billion plus year that we had for ransomware activity a couple of years ago. And just like with stolen funds, the second half of the year was not that. So once we published our ransomware section for the crime report, it basically showed that there was a significant, in fact, record second half drawdown relative to the first half in terms of ransomware activity. And you see this interestingly play out across a couple of different measures. So they were receiving fewer payments. However, leak site data suggests that attacks remained high, if not increased into the second half. And so you've got this interesting dynamic where it looks like there was an unwillingness to pay potentially. And you see some of that further get represented by, for example, a growing gap in the demanded ransom amount to the paid ransom amount. So if you imagine like the ransomware actor demanded $1 million, but they got 500,000, you have a 50% gap or negotiated payment amount relative to the demanded amount. And the one expectation you would have, I think, if attacks remain constant or even go up and payments go down is that the victims actually get into a stronger negotiating position because there's a revenue constraint on the ransomware groups. They're basically not getting paid as often. And so they should, on average, kind of accept less. And that seems to be represented in the data too. But it's also one of those things where in the mid-year, when we were talking about what was happening with that category of illicit activity, I did not expect that. It was basically, we were on track for a year north of $1 billion and we did not. So that's quite a good sign, unrelated to geopolitics, more related to the sort of tacit or otherwise coordination of the ecosystem in terms of an unwillingness to pay, but an unexpected trend, shall we say, coming through from halfway through the year to the end of the year.
Absolutely. I think reduced or depressed willingness to pay from ransomware victims was an encouraging signal in that section, and certainly will be interesting to keep our eyes on that in the year ahead. So I want to go back in time a little bit. Last year at Chainalysis, we introduced signals data. Can you walk our listeners through what those data are, how they figure into the findings of the 2025 crime report, and also how you incorporate them in your research?
So signals are a complement to our existing ground truth or evidentiary attributions. And so if you imagine the evidentiary attributions is like, I've seen this address associated with a scam live in the wild somewhere. So I have a very high degree of confidence that it is associated with this scam. Signals is more like looking for a pattern of activity and basically inferring from that pattern of activity that an address or a cluster is a form of illicit activity. Could be, although it would apply equally in kind of legitimate activity as well. But the sort of colloquialism would be something like if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it probably is a duck, as opposed to DNA testing the duck and determining that it's a duck. And so the complementarity there is that ground truth or evidentiary attributions, they require that hard proof that can be pointed to. And the advantage of that is that you have a high degree of certainty and accuracy there. The disadvantage is that you have to find that information before you can render that judgment. The advantage of signals is that in a complementary sense, it gives you a lower degree of certainty because you're sort of inferring from a pattern of behavior what something is as opposed to knowing it for sure. But you have a lot more real-time application because the pattern can be active for a very short interval before you recognize it on chain and then therefore start to label as, say, a suspected scam or a suspected darknet market, the associated addresses or clusters. And so the nice thing about this is that the two are complementary. Obviously, evidentiary attributions or sort of supersede something that's identified by a heuristic, but you end up with a good way to approximate, especially short-term changes on chain via signals, and then can let kind of some of the longer run attributions be picked up by the evidentiary approach. And so it has this effect of augmenting volumes, which is advantageous because I think we know and note always in our report that our estimates are a lower boundary guess at the amount of illicit activity that's happening on chain. And signals goes a long way to kind of starting to pick up some of that slack. The other thing is it lets you make a little bit more sense of some of the categories of activity, especially the really fast-paced ones, where if on-chain infrastructure tends to get used and then discarded with a high degree of rapidity, ground truth attributions, evidentiary attributions where you've seen the addresses explicitly linked to that form of illicit activity can have a hard time keeping up, whereas signals is sort of built to not do that. It's basically like, okay, well, this address is behaving exactly like this other address. We see no on-chain connection between the two, but based strictly on that pattern of behavior, we think that they are engaged in the same kind of activity. And so you can really augment your more real-time knowledge of events via signals, which is, I think, highly advantageous. And that sort of continues to get built out as new patterns get recognized and over time.
That's awesome. And I think for our users of our data, who perhaps some of them in the public sector require a very high threshold or degree of certainty to use data in a certain way, I think for those who are more in the investigative space, who perhaps need more of the lead generation and more kind of get me onto the right track or things that have a behavioral analysis kind of component, the augmentation that you describe, it's very clear to see why that would be useful, I think, not only in the public sector, but for crypto compliance officers and TradFi as well, who are looking to pick apart complex networks. What surprised you the most this crime season? Perhaps the most and the least. What were you looking at and you said, yeah, this is what I thought, anecdotally. I was watching the price of BTC. I was looking at this. I've kind of been looking at ransomware and scams all the time. And so this might refine, I'm dotting my I's and crossing my T's here, but where were your suspicions confirmed and where were you a bit, I won't say bowled over, but surprised perhaps?
I think it's tricky because on the one hand, the first thing that comes to mind is that nothing surprises me anymore. I'm kind of fine with.
Is that a challenge?
I'm kind of fine with the idea that anything could happen in any which direction and it wouldn't really surprise me.
Yes.
That being said, there are, on the one hand, the best predictor of the future is usually what happened today. Tomorrow is probably going to be pretty similar. Mm-hmm. And so when we saw, as we talked about, some of these categories of activity, when we looked in June, July, we're doing one thing, and then all of a sudden by the end, they're just not doing that at all. They're petered out and, volumes have dropped significantly. That came as a surprise in light of the work we were doing halfway through the year compared to the end of the year. So I think that was, typically speaking, pretty surprising. I think at a more macro level, the tight integration we observed in many of the sections between off-chain events and on-chain activity was pretty telling. We looked for a reason. We thought that there might be some association, for example, between European elections and the intensity of support for extremist groups. That was a plausible hypothesis going in. We sort of said, what's happening before these events, what's happening after these events, you can quantify that and measure it. Same with the BTC outflows from Iranian exchanges. We weren't looking at random. We were thinking very concretely that the pattern of tensions between Iran and Israel and what BTC sort of represents in terms of a safe haven asset that's a bearer asset held by individuals, we had a reason to look where we looked, but the degree to which we were finding these results that are just sort of clear-cut patterns of on-chain activity associated in time with these off-chain events was quite revealing. And I think we've kind of just started to scratch the surface there. That I was shocked with our hit rate, for lack of a better term, where we were looking in a few places driven by hypotheses and we found stuff almost every single time. And that was pretty revealing. Yeah. So again, sort of a nice, pleasant surprise that we're finding this tight integration between off-chain events and on-chain activity. And then least surprising, I think, to our earlier conversation, that the way in which the aggregate volumes kind of shook out, so not category-specific volumes where you might see an underperformance in the second half relative to expectations, all that sort of thing, but just in aggregate, it kind of ended up more or less where I thought it probably would. And that, I think, speaks to the way in which an in-aggregate picture is pretty sticky. So you'll see these micro changes where this actor does more than that actor and something like that within a category, but in aggregate, there's a certain degree to which illicit activity, there's only so much of it that can happen, and there's a substitution. So one scam's gain comes at the expense of another scam at the margin. And so the scam volumes in total weren't necessarily as surprising as if you look at it sort of year over year. Same with some of these other categories of activity. Is sort of like one darknet market. If there's a finite pool of people who are using these marketplaces, like one market's gain is going to come at the expense of another. And in fact, we kind of quantify some of that with that Abacus darknet market that I mentioned before, where when a marketplace called ASAP shut down, the next month we saw a big surge that continued for several months in Abacus market inflows, because these are two of the prominent darknet markets facilitating drug exchange in the Western facing world. So it stands to reason that people just sort of migrated over. So that kind of stickiness of those aggregate trends, I find to be one of the least surprising results. That is basically, I don't want to go out on a limb and make a prediction in March about where I think things will end up, but I'm going to do it anyways. That, for example, with darknet markets,
Let's have it.
I bet you darknet markets, and we can revisit this next year and see if this is the case. Given what I just said, like if you take darknet markets, they had a little north of 2 billion in aggregate in 2024. And I suspect that if we were to revisit this conversation next year, what we would find is that for 2025, darknet market aggregate inflows probably going to be a little north of 2 billion. The composition, which darknet market predominates, all that, very subject to change, can be surprising, but I think it's going to be more or less 2 to 2.5 billion. That's my guess.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, what you say about the unlikelihood of dramatic year-over-year changes in the aggregate for some of these categories, it makes me think of something you said, at the beginning of our conversation, which is the dramatic changes are taking place as they would in economics or kind of in other macro categories over time. So if you look at the crypto market and the evolution of an ecosystem that was BTC dominated, now you look at how many stablecoins and altcoins and kind of the proliferation of tokens and ways to transfer value. You look at ransomware, took so much oxygen out of many conversations and is still a persistent threat, not to take away incident response, and the threat to critical infrastructure is real and very important. However, with the explosive growth in scams, sanctions evasion is front and center given the way the world looks today. I think those are kind of more of the dramatic conversation shifts and kind of even paradigm shifts that we're seeing as crypto continues to expand into different crime types and also across different markets.
And really thinking about the last, let's say, 5 years, I think there's 2 periods of discontinuity in the data. One was in 2022, and that was the year where the Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned Garantex, Russian exchange.
Also the year of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. A tremendous year for sanctioning authorities and for those focusing on sanctions. Yeah.
And Tornado Cash as well was in August of that year. And those 2 events caused a humongous explosion in volumes because Garantex explicitly said we are not subject to U.S. jurisdiction, therefore we're not going to shut down. They are now shut down, and that's going to have an implication. And Tornado Cash, as a smart contract mixer, could not be shut down. Friction could be added to using it, but it was still up and running and has now been removed, as far as I understand it, from the SDN list. So what's going to happen is a discontinuity in 2022 as volumes increase significantly because those sanctioned entities remained up and in operation, which was historically anomalous relative to other sanctioned entities, at least with a crypto dimension. And what's going to happen next year is that those 2 things that have been huge drivers of sanctioned entity volume in our data are gone now. One's no longer sanctioned and the other is just shut down. So you have this interesting dynamic where that was a big discontinuous break. And then in 2024, the other discontinuity is the growth in illicit actor activity, this sort of professionalized ecosystem that's not itself explicitly doing scamming, but is facilitating scamming, or is not itself doing ransomware attacks, but is facilitating it by selling credentials or access or whatever it happens to be. And that ecosystem just exploded last year. And that caused like a pretty big boost to our total numbers. And so those would be over the last several years, I think, the 2 points of discontinuity. And one of them just flipped back the other way so far based on what's happened in 2025. So the 2025 report's going to be a weird one relative to what we've done over the last several years, just because humongous hacks, big services get closed.
Like a lot has happened, and we're recording this in
March.
In late March. I think 2025 might be the year that finally surprises Eric Jardine. That's going to be my statement. And for our listeners who are interested in sanctions and Garantex in particular, we published a blog a couple weeks ago on the takedown that takes a look at its activity over time, why it was designated, some of its greatest hits, if you will. So check that out on our blog. My final question for you, Eric, and I'll preface this by saying I'm not going to report you to RCMP, so feel free to answer freely. What is your favorite on-chain crime type and why? Which section or sections lately, having done the report quite a few times and helping drive our research here at Chainalysis, do you have a favorite section to kind of research and look into and work on? Or is there one that you're, this is a little bit pedestrian cybercrime for Eric?
I don't have a set favorite. I find them all enjoyable. I
love all my children equally.
Yeah, I think the one that like boils to the top in any given year is largely driven by what's happening in that category of activity during that calendar year. Harkening back to just now, like 2022, I think my favorite section was probably the sanction section. We had this sort of big break with OFAC past trajectory. They began sanctioning services. Those services remained in operation. And that let us explore questions of compliance. It let us explore questions of effect in terms of, ripples throughout the entire illicit actor ecosystem and this sort of thing. So that section was really interesting.
Transitioning from designations of individuals, one small part of a network, to service level designations, which have obviously big ramifications for data and compliance.
Right. So that was like a super interesting section in that year. And, sanctions remains an interesting one, but, that was really a big on the ground change with how things were unfolding. Last year, or 2 years ago, I guess, the report for the annual year 2023, ransomware was a very big deal. And we were trying to make sense of what we observed in the 2022 data, where we saw a significant 2022 drawdown in ransomware activity. And what we discovered in early 2023 was that was due largely to an FBI infiltration of a ransomware strain. And so we were able to kind of work through and quantify just how big was that effect in terms of the operation. And then we got to intersect that with the big rebound that we saw in 2023, where ransomware volumes crested 1 billion for the first time. So we had, a really interesting ransomware section that year because of on the ground events. And then through this year, we saw several sections, I think, largely quite interesting due to what was happening with the activity. So scamming was really interesting because of this growing professionalization and leveraging AI services, which I think is only going to, based on what we're seeing in terms of compound annual growth for some of these services, so that's probably only going to accelerate into the future. I don't have a favorite. They're all great, but it really the ones that I find most will stick with me the longest, where I can muse about them in 10 years over a cup of coffee, will always be the ones that the category itself had some big moves, positive or negative. And that usually piques my interest, and then I want to try to make sense of why, and then try to represent that as well as I can in the section.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the excellent conversation. I think our listeners will find it illuminating. The 2025 Crypto Crime Report is available on the Chainalysis website. Check it out and read through it. Thanks so much.
For having me.
One of the topics that Eric covered was the professionalization of money laundering connected to crypto, including in the drug trade. Last week, our team published a blog about crypto's role in the global fentanyl trade, and how the transparency of the blockchain shines a light on this insidious activity while offering opportunities for disruption. The on-chain nexus to the fentanyl ecosystem is more substantial and broader than commonly understood. In our blog, we identify a large array of players involved with these transnational networks. We include graphs showing how Chainalysis traced significant transfers from wallets belonging to Chinese fentanyl precursor suppliers, and highlight how the trade is expanding all across the globe, far beyond industrial manufacturers and vendors. Head down to the show notes to read the full report.